Believe it or not, I don't actually know what metering mode my camera is set to. In this video, we're going to look at the different camera metering modes, what they do, and why I don't really care about any of them. So, not knowing which metering mode I use might sound odd coming from a professional photographer, especially when every other video or article on the internet will tell you just how useful different metering modes are. But let me explain why it's not so useful to me, but some of them might be useful to you depending on the type of photography that you do. Camera metering in photography. Metering in camera refers to the process where the camera evaluates the amount of reflected light in a scene and calculates what it thinks to be the correct exposure. The camera does this based on the assumption that the brightness of the scene should be 18% reflectivity of a particular level of grey. A grey that basically reflects back 18% of the light that it receives and absorbs or scatters the rest. If it calculates the scene to be above the 18% value, it will show the image as being overexposed. And if it calculates it to be less than 18% grey, it will show it as underexposed. This was the benchmark measurement for cameras metering in the last few decades. When shooting in automatic modes like shutter priority or aperture priority, the metering mode you use will determine what exposure settings are used. When shooting in manual mode, the metering mode will only provide the light meter reading, telling you whether the camera thinks the image is under or overexposed. But using different metering modes allows us to choose which parts of the scene the camera evaluates or gives priority to. Different camera makes and models have slight differences in their modes, so I've put together the most common ones, how they work and when to use them. Metering modes explained. Most Canon, Nikon, Sony and Hasselblad cameras offer the following metering modes. Canon, evaluative, center weighted, spot and partial metering. Nikon, matrix, center weighted, spot and highlight weighted. Sony, multi-pattern, center weighted, spot and entire screen average. Hasselblad, center weighted, center spot and spot metering. So, as we've discovered, the camera's meter will provide you with information about how much light is coming into the camera so that you or the camera can make decisions as to what aperture, shutter speed and ISO combinations are best for the current shooting scenario. So let's take a look at each of these metering modes and why they differ in the readings that they provide. Evaluative, matrix and multi-pattern. This mode splits the scene into grids. The number of grids depends on the camera and each grid is individually analysed to determine the highlight and shadow detail. During this process, slightly more preference is given to the zones where the focus point is. From this, it calculates an average on which the recommended exposure is based. Center weighted metering. When using this mode, the exposure is determined largely by tones in the center of the image. Here, the camera does not consider the edges of the frame or which focus point is selected. Typically, center weighted metering is used when the subject is in the center of the frame and we just want to expose for that. Spot metering. The most precise of the metering modes, spot metering evaluates light around the chosen focus point or the very center of the frame. This provides a precise reading from a very small area of the scene, which means it can be a very effective choice for high contrast and backlit situations. Those are the most common modes in DSLR cameras today, but there are other options available too. Some Canon cameras feature partial metering as a fourth option. This mode is similar to spot metering, but it also allows you to take a reading from a slightly larger area than the more selective spot zone. Another mode offered by Nikon is highlight weighted metering, which meters for the highlights to ensure they are not overexposed. This mode is also available in some Sony cameras too. Sony also offers a fifth option in some cameras called entire screen average. That measures the brightness of the entire scene as a whole, which you could also consider similar to evaluative or matrix metering. Hasselblad cameras refer to their metering options slightly differently. Their center-weighted mode evaluates approximately 25% of the scene and is best suited to scenes with fairly even tones throughout. Center spot prioritizes the central section of the screen and is suited to scenes where the subject is in the center of the frame. Spot metering, like other cameras, provides an accurate measurement of a very small area and disregards any information outside of that area. Now, it's worth pointing out at this point, with all of these spot metering and partial metering modes, you can move the camera and relocate it over a position or a subject to the third, lock the metering, and then recompose the shot. If you're unsure of which camera settings you need, then using your camera's metering system can be helpful, especially if you know which metering mode to use for a given scenario. Let's look at a real-world example of the different metering modes and the results that they provide. I'll run through the 4 metering mode options on this camera with the camera in automatic shooting mode to see the results. So this is spot metering. I'm taking a reading off of Georgie's body and I'm going to lock that exposure, recompose and shoot. Center weighted. Meter, shoot, evaluative, and shoot. So now I'm going to go into manual mode. I don't really care which metering mode I'm in, and I'm just going to make my own exposure settings based on the results that I see on screen. So I'm going to move slightly to the side this time, where we haven't got quite so much direct light, and we'll go through my exposure setting in manual. So now let's go back into program mode and run through the 4 metering modes again. So we'll start with that one. Automatic mode, metering mode, evaluative, metering mode, partial, and metering mode spot. Okay, let's see the results. Evaluative metering, as I've already touched on, is a good option to go with if you're shooting scenes where you want to get the exposure as close to correct as possible for the entire scene. It's also a good option if you're unsure of which mode to use. Landscape images are one example where you may want to use evaluative metering. Using this mode will help you get the best overall exposure for the whole scene, even if there are bright highlights or deep shadows in different areas of the scene. Center-weighted metering is best suited for any image where your subject is largely in the center of the frame, or even where the subject fills the majority of the scene. A typical example of this would be portraiture or macro photography. For any scene where you want to expose a very particular area, spot metering would be the best choice. Examples of where you might use this would be when photographing the moon or any high contrast scene where you want the subject to be correctly exposed. But as mentioned, you don't need to limit your spot metering to the center of the frame or your subject in the center, because you can use the spot metering lock button to recompose the shot. The limitations of metering modes. So why don't I know or care which metering mode my camera is in? Well, if you're familiar with working in manual mode and you know the difference between 1-stop or 2 stops exposure difference, then you will already likely know a starting point for the settings of your camera anyway. For example, back in the days of film, or when camera metering wasn't as accurate, we often had in mind what the exposure should be for a variety of situations. They even used to print on film packets what the exposures would be for sunny, hazy or cloudy situations, and it was only a case of then working out your f-stops and shutter speed combinations from that point, which is very easy to do when you understand using your camera in manual. As such, I'm not concerned by which metering mode my camera is in, because it's not going to be able to tell me anything that I don't know already, or I can't correct myself with a couple of clicks. I measure the light visually by looking at the result and the histogram, and then decide on what exposure settings to use from there. It's only really when you're working in automatic or semi-automatic modes that metering really comes in handy. So if you're shooting a portrait in aperture priority against a bright background, then partial or spot metering is likely to be your best choice. If you're shooting a landscape scene with a broad range of tones, then evaluative metering will probably be best for that situation. But none of the metering modes will guarantee you the correct exposure, or will they balance out all of the exposure range in the scene. You still have to look at the image and then make decisions, such as if you need to darken the sky, you might want to use a neutral density graduated filter. Or if you need the background scene correctly exposed and the model correctly exposed, then you'll need to think about a reflector or fill-in flash to compensate. White on white or black on black scenes can also prove problematic, as your camera will often underexpose white objects on a white background and overexpose black objects on a black background, simply because the light meter was expecting or relying on 18% reflectivity as its benchmark. These reasons are exactly why I also don't use a flash meter when working in the studio, because I find I can do the job more quickly and more accurately by myself or by other means. It's important to keep in mind that metering modes, although useful, do have their limitations. It may even be that you feel that using your camera's metering consistently gives over or underexposed results. In this case, it's possible to use something called exposure compensation to help overcome this problem. Exposure compensation, also known as EV, can be used to make corrections to the exposure. Usually indicated by a plus or minus symbol, most cameras generally offer exposure compensation values of -3 to +3 stops, with varying increments in between. For images that consistently appear too dark, setting the exposure compensation to +1 EV, for example, will help brighten the image by 1 stop and vice versa. An EV setting of 0 means no adjustments will be made to the image. Although features like exposure compensation can help you fine-tune your light meter in your camera, if you want to take full control of your images, it's best to use your camera in manual mode and set your own camera settings based on the results that you want and through experience. I've got a completely free 2 hours photography course that is the benchmark for photographers wanting to master their camera in manual mode. It covers everything from understanding exposure, ISO, composition, shutter speeds, apertures, lens choices, and the types of cameras, and has lots of shooting examples. You don't even need to sign up for this course. Just head to my website and you can watch it right away. Plus, you can access our 90-page free photo guide that accompanies this free course. So hopefully this has helped you understand a bit more about metering modes and which ones to use when. Check out the free course on my website for more, and thanks for watching.